Now hear this, Liberty Call.
Good morning. My name's Richard, but I prefer Dick. U.S. Coast Guard veteran, 55 years ago. Been dealing with these Navy guys on the Slater since spring of 1998. Actually, I was strangely invited. I knew the ship was here in Albany, but one Sunday morning after church, my wife said, "Hey, let's get down and see that Navy ship that's in the port." So I said, "Oh, okay." So we went down, took the tour, and there was another fellow who was part of the Slater crew, was following us around. And I thought this was strange. I don't believe in one-upping a tour guide. I think it's discourteous. If there was any questions or something to be asked, I would do it afterward because I didn't want to embarrass the tour guide person. I didn't have to worry. He was a Slater veteran from back in World War II, but that's okay. We get to the end of the tour, and the fellow who had been following us, he was wearing khakis like a chief or an officer. And he's standing at the head of the gangway with his hands behind his back. He doesn't introduce himself, but he says, "You were in the Navy." I said, "No." He says, "You must have been in the Navy. I heard you explaining to the lady stuff about the ship." I said, "No." He says, "Well, how do you know so much about the ship?" And I said, "I was in the Coast Guard." And he says, "Ah, damn shallow water sailor." And he takes his hands from behind his back with a piece of paper and he says, "Well, here's a volunteer application. Even you guys know the bow from the stern and the port from the starboard. We need you as a tour guide." And here I am. People, really. A ship is people. Otherwise, it's a pile of steel. And it has been fun. And things here really came into a plan. And I like things that are comfortably organized. Up in the Wheelhouse. Specifically because unless you're out on deck, everything was inside the ship. And then you finally got people up 2 decks up and they could look out windows, portholes, port lights, pardon me, or doors if the weather was warm and the doors were open. And you could kind of try to give them an impression of what it was like to be there operationally. Active duty in the Coast Guard from August of 1965 to August of 1969. I did 2 years in the inactive reserve to complete my military obligation of 6. And then after a hiatus of 2 years, I went back into the active reserves for another 12 years. So I had 16 years in the Coast Guard, technically. What have I learned? Well, one is I find myself enjoying people a lot more than I thought I would. But my late wife says that I'm just like my father. My father was a very gregarious fellow, and it looks like I am too. I feel like I'm part of a family, a bunch of mostly brothers. There's a few sisters in there too, but mostly brothers. And for the most part, there's a good bunch of comradeship. And even though the biggest thing the Coast Guard ever let me play on was a motor lifeboat, I feel like I have shipmates. One was, I had a fellow on a tour who didn't say much, older gentleman. And at the end of the tour, he wanted to chat. That's when I found out that when he was 17 years old in 1944, He was an enlisted man on a German submarine. And he said with his fairly good English, he said, "Yeah, I come here. I want to see what kind of ship was chasing me around in the North Atlantic." I'm not Army type. A restored 36-foot vintage Coast Guard motor lifeboat would be good.